This video is brought to you in part by Mantis Sleep. More on them in a bit. A thought crossed my mind recently, and I know I'm not the first to have it. Why has there never been a single game quite like Spyro the Dragon? To be clear, that could go for the PS1 trilogy as a whole, but I'm actually just talking about Spyro 1. Even its sequels had a marked shift in approach as the team grew both in size and design experience. And those subtle, iterative changes still led to wonderful games in their own right, often seen as better than this one. But even those little brothers don't scratch the same itch. The sequels focus a bit more on missions. They guide you through the level better, and while these were the correct design decisions to have made, it means that those games have a smaller emphasis on organic discovery, on throwing you into a small sandbox with a limited, defined moveset and more or less telling you to figure out on your own how to collect all the gems. I'm also not just talking about any old open world collectathon, trust me, I've played most. There's something about Spyro specifically that hits a different feeling in your brain and in your heart than contemporary collectathons like Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie or, yes, Croc. There aren't indie revivals for Spyro like you see with other games in the genre, at least none that have made it more than a year in development before going on hiatus, or that don't also attempt to capture a general PS1 platformer vibe that pulls equally from the Bandicoots of the world. I've combed through my mind palace of platformer memories. I've pored over lists of collectathons to see what I missed. I've looked at a fucking Muppets game because somehow that one might have come the closest.
Hello.
Here's a little secret, I'm not even a huge Spyro fan, and yet I'm down bad for something that makes me feel something. I could have finally played Spyro 3 for the first time instead of doing this, but I don't like Sergeant Bird's vibe. So I played Spyro again, twice actually, to try and answer this question. Why are there no games that hit quite the same way as Spyro 1? This time around, I think I figured out what it is that, at least to me, makes Spyro 1 a one-of-one game, and it comes down to a few core, sometimes overlapping points. This is Spyro the Dragon. So those key points, what are they? Well, I've put together a quick and easy acronym that you can always remember and recite when arguing on Reddit or whatever you do. Spyro 1 is A-Drag. A is for an unlimited commitment to a limited moveset. Not only is Spyro one of the few quadrupedal protagonists in any three-dimensional game, meaning that he had to be designed to control more like a car than your usual Scrimblow, it also informed his moveset. No wall jumps, no double jumps, no grabbing on ledges, yet. And from the jump, you have every move in the game available to you, which means that every time you enter a level, you know you're already equipped to complete it fully. D stands for developers that didn't fully know what they were doing yet. Since whole worlds were being developed by smaller groups of individuals, every level tends to bring its own identity and represent the folks behind it. This means a swaying difficulty curve. It means fresh engineering grads trying to design a more hardcore game and having to be broken into designing games for children. It means tutorials that are out of sequence, and this all leads to a game where often you just have to organically figure it out yourself, just like they were doing behind the computers. This leads to point R, rare anti-level design, also known as this game is like Dark Souls when expressed by people who don't words good. From levels that have corners so sharply angled and missable that they would be criticized both back then and today as poor game design form, to designing stages as if they're cohesive, lived-in areas first and jungle gyms second, to tiny ledges on rooftops that house gems and collectibles. From the opening world, Spyro 1 is showing you that you must throw out what you expect from a platformer. The tall, encircling hills that usually gate you off inside a collectathon world, you can get on top of those, and there are things there. That glimmer in the distance, you know you can reach it because you have your full moveset already, but how are you gonna get high enough to glide over there? Every stage is not only a series of puzzles to be solved or a mountain to conquer, it's a real place. And finally, a touch of good old Insomniac Games magic. There's just something about how these folks make games that finds a way to stand out. When they transport you into their crafted worlds, they work in a level of detail that other companies often struggle to match. That includes both these wonderfully ethereal aesthetics from an artistic perspective, but also from a technical standpoint, straight up creating one of the first comprehensive level of detail systems on the PS1, so that their vistas could stretch out further without distance fog or pop-in, and give you that uncompromised feeling of an expansive level with endless possibilities. Now that's only 453 words, so I expect that it'll become the standard soon enough. Until you have it memorized though, make sure to subscribe so you can come back to revise. In practice, what does this all mean? Well, let's start with the first point. Spyro in his first outing has a clearly defined moveset limited to essentially 4 moves. He has a single jump along with a midair descending glide, a charging dash move that doubles as an attack, and a short-range flame breath. He also has a dodge roll that, yeah, it's situationally useful at best. That's the one time the game's unlimited commitment to its moveset is limited. Spyro 1, if you count the overworlds as their own sort of level, which they are, has 3 dozen stages. When said aloud, that's kind of insane, especially for 1998. You can just imagine the back-of-the-box sort of arguments that PS1 kids had saying this game was twice as big as Mario 64. In the context of our hero's moveset though, 5 full worlds?
Or is it 6?
Feels intimidating. How do you make a collectathon compelling, progressively challenging, and fun throughout 36 distinct levels and themes when all you can do is jump, glide, flame, and dash? The answer sounds obvious when you say it aloud: iteration and discovery, but that's not something that's just simple to implement. If it was, every game would be good. Allow me to get the first world out of the way now while talking about this so that we don't have to jump back here later. This first realm, home to the Artisans tribe of dragons, has quickly become one of my favorite tutorial areas as I've been digging down in my notes and analyzing it. It's mostly just masterfully done, with a few exceptions that you could still argue hit on some of the game's key lessons. The Artisans hub itself, as well as the 5 levels therein, each focus in on one facet of what was going to make or break the entire rest of the game. The hub world itself opens by putting you in front of one of the dragons encased in crystal by our villain Nasty Nork, showing you one of the things Spyro's gotta do, and then it gives you a 100% safe ground to explore, with every enemy just running away from you and never fighting back. Some enemies like the Gem Thief take a few consecutive hits to kill, goading you into hitting him a few times by dropping one of those shiny, cool-looking gems each time. Remember that this had to be approached as the very first game some kids would have played, and the language of video games a lot of us tend to forget is not ingrained from the start. Talented designers usually have to trick us into learning it after they first spend months banging their heads against the wall watching all of the incredible ways that new players can and will mess it up without good guidance. To that end, this opening has wide prairies to get you used to your movement and charge attack, corridors to get you acclimated with the game's camera controls, because even kids that had played games before were maybe getting this with a PS1 under their tree, and this might be their first 3-dimensional game. And there's an incredibly precise ledge that serves both to help you practice your glide and to hammer home that you need to jump and glide from the highest point possible if you want to clear the landing. Even diehard fans need this little reminder sometimes, since you just bonk off ledges until Spyro learns how to have thumbs in the sequel. The first game's not the most forgiving with the glide spacing in particular, and being able to mess it up a couple times in a safe space is really good calibration. As first-time players are messing around with the game here, they'll probably pull up the inventory menu with select, or by way of the pause menu, and this clearly lays out how many gems, dragons, and dragon eggs are in each stage, and shows you how much you have left to go. Of course, if you're just messing around and haven't had the collectionist urge hit yet, you might end up meandering into one of the portals to a more dedicated level. Most likely, that level will be Stone Hill. This stage is right in the middle of that prairie area, and it's kind of an extension of the hub itself. It's similarly designed, with wide open grasslands and clear corridors taking you from one area to the other so you can't really get lost. The key differences are, 1, that enemies will fight back, giving you time to learn about the game's health system and how to replenish it using all of the roaming sheep throughout this level. 2, this stage instills that look-everywhere anti-level design mentality I mentioned earlier by letting you explore that upper wall and find hidden gems in the corners up there. 3, you're acquainted to the Egg Thief enemy on that upper wall, which is the first skill test that forces you to prove that you know how to use the charge attack. And 4, Stone Hill, and actually every level in World 1 besides the hub, introduces more kinds of chests beyond the basic one that was featured in the overworld. In just this 5-minute level, you've learned that there's a third and fourth kind of collectible, the dragon eggs, and occasionally a key for locked chests. And you've also learned that there are metal chests that can't be broken open by flames, reinforcing that sometimes you do have to use that charge attack that you just proved you knew how to use. Oh, and if you didn't learn it in the hub area, you might also learn here that Spyro doesn't know how to swim yet. Technically, that hub wasn't 100% safe. Jumping to another of the levels in World 1, Dark Hollow might also be your first stage depending on how you roamed. This one's purely a linear tutorial that spells out as simply as possible Spyro's moveset with regards to enemies. The first of the invading Norks you see here have metal shields, since players are more likely to spam the simple flame attack than the at first kind of unwieldy dash. If you didn't learn about having to charge into metal things yet, you'll have to learn it here, followed immediately by a larger Nork who will cause you to bounce off if you keep charging into him. This guy happens to be holding wooden weapons, a clear as day cue to flame his ass. If any kids struggle to figure this out on their own, the 2 dragons on the main level path will lay it out clearly for you when you save them. Like in Stonehill, there's a locked chest, only this time it's not hidden in a well, it's sitting dead center on a raised platform. There's also a level exit right after that locked chest and one of those dragons, welcoming you to leave but also nudging you to turn back around since you know you have unfinished business, especially if you just learned how to kill the big guys. Once you do turn back around, you'll notice a brand new hallway tucked off to the side that you wouldn't have been able to see when coming through into this part of the level. This sort of sharp turn is actually something Insomniac had to address in later games like the early Ratchet & Clanks, because it's not traditionally best practice and there's a good chance people will miss that and get stuck. But in a game like Spyro, this modern design faux pas actually serves a benefit, teaching you that you have to look closely everywhere and leave no corner untouched. To get all the goodies down this corridor though, you've got to put what you've learned all together in one go, as the hallways are being patrolled by big unchargeable enemies that happen to be wearing metal armor and are carrying wooden weapons. You can't get past him easily, it's too narrow. Once he turns around though, you'll see the armor is only covering his front like one of those bad Kiss the Chef aprons. And like should happen to anybody wearing one of those aprons, you more literally flame his ass. What I'll call the third level in Spyro's first world, Town Square, puts this all together with a more confined stage full of turns that make you use the camera more, enemies that charge at you and keep you on your toes, an egg thief that's now jumping up and down on platforms instead of just running on a flat circle, in turn forcing you to learn how to stop and start with the charge. And most importantly, this town square is full of bottomless pits that put a greater emphasis on showing that you know how to glide. In all likelihood, this might be the first spot where you learn that touching those dragon pedestals and saving dragons in general will checkpoint you at that spot if you die. Plus, this is where the extra life counter may start being important for newbies. Lives are usually plentiful, and once you've gotten used to the game, only a few levels will actually give you much flack, by which point you've got a good stockpile of extra lives. But if you do run low, refilling can be a bit of a grind. It is an older video game after all. You can either find Slim Cognito hiding in a clamshell in some stages and violently murder him to get a free 1-up, or you have to get 20 pearls by defeating previously defeated enemies whose gems you've already collected. You'd think the pearl would have come from the clam, but hey. Now the last thing Town Square does to teach you is throw 2 new types of treasure chest out to further iterate on Spyro's essentially 3 moves. There's one that vertically spits out a gem when hit so that you have to time your jumps to grab it, useful for getting you acclimated to more precise jumps or instances where you might be landing right near an enemy and want to jump and flame in rapid succession. And the other one requires you to flame it multiple times in quick succession for it to break. A cute little teaser for the upcoming boss level, packed full of wolves that take 2 hits to defeat but don't die or drop any gems on the first flame. Again, it's building up your knowledge base and making you start to put it all together. Functionally, you could say the stuff I've highlighted here, what the game teaches you in World 1, you could say that's the whole game. You now know to look everywhere, backtrack, pay attention to enemy designs and think about which attacks to use to best take them down, and you know to watch corners while precisely platforming. Each of these will be reinforced over and over again over the course of the game, since kids might miss a level or need to be reminded by the infrequent dragon that's actually, kind of helpful. If you're unfamiliar with the original version of this game, a bunch of dragons just kinda say thanks or start old man rambling until Spyro runs away.
Thank you for releasing me. Now let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video.
No.
So this is not an exaggeration, it's not part of any ad copy. I have been using my Manta sleep masks just about every night since we first worked together over a year ago. And from what some of you have told me, you have too. So A, I'm really glad they helped, and B, thank you, because they're back. For the longest time, I was rocking the Manta Silk because it hit just the perfect combination for me of comfort as a side sleeper, complete and total blackout, and not feeling too warm or having to reposition it a bunch if I tossed and turned. Most recently though, I've been trying out the Manta Sound, which has an adjustable set of Bluetooth headphones sewn into the outer mask. I figured it'd be useful during long flights or trips, or if I just want to listen to something as I'm taking a nap without worrying about my earbud falling out and my dog trying to eat it. He specifically likes earbuds. I've been impressed with how good this mask is at giving you clear audio without others around you hearing it. Even at its loudest setting, you would have to really listen in to hear what videos or music your partner uses as a lullaby. Spoilers, it's me. Between the variety of masks available, the adjustable headphone positioning on this one and the adjustable eye cup placement on all of Manta's masks, these things are easy to mold into exactly the most comfortable fit for you. Best of all, Manta won't break the bank, especially if you use my code TGB at checkout to get 10% off. It's a perfect gift for yourself or your loved ones, especially those that struggle the most with sleep, to help them make this year their coziest one yet. A great nap or great sleep makes the entire rest of your day better, and you can never pay too much for that. But with Manta Sleep and the code TGB, you won't have to either. Thanks again to Manta for sponsoring this segment, and now, back to the video. After World 1, there are really only a couple new types of chest, namely a firework crate that will explode and hurt if you're too close. And there are only so many ways you can reinvent how to glide or tweak enemies to be more than just pick the right attack, right? This is where that iteration and discovery really meld and make something truly special. The Ice Caverns level in World 2 is a fantastic example of this, utilizing ice physics on enemies instead of just affecting the player like many games would tend to do. Here we've got the big unchargeable baddies that are wearing metal armor. Or they should be unchargeable, rather. Since they're on ice, however, you can hit them and push them back, kinda like the bully enemies in Mario 64. Shove them right off the edge, and a gem will fly right out of the abyss to reward you. Way later in the game, World 5 is home to the Dreamweavers tribe of dragons, an even more magical group than the ones found in the Magic Crafters earlier in the game. Don't think about it too much, but this world is full of tweaks that, well, tweak the mechanics in some new and fun ways, namely by way of the Fool enemies. These guys are usually invincible, more like obstacles than enemies, and they each have a different type of effect when hit depending on the level you're in. Many of them just activate a time-sensitive platform, following in the game's relatively normal difficulty progression of making you do the same things but with tighter and faster windows. However, in Dark Passage, the Fools hold a lantern that creates this alternating light-dark motif. Incredibly well done for a PS1 game that's simulating quickly changing lighting, as an aside. Otherwise peaceful or unintimidating creatures in the light cast a much more savage shadow when the Fool flips the switch. Or you can just hit the Fool to knock the light on more permanently. Although most enemies tend to echo the few templates we've gone over, the big boy that's invulnerable to charges, the metal armor that needs to be charged, each world finds a new string of ways to distract you from the fact that Spyro's limited moveset could easily have gotten stale in the wrong hands. Sometimes it's as simple as putting an oh-so-satisfying line of baddies all in a row for you to charge through. When everything Spyro does feels so satisfying and so right, when the sounds of crunching into enemies and the jingle of collecting gems are fine-tuned to hit that perfect spot in your brain, just giving you more of that is more than enough sometimes. The fourth world, Beastmakers, isn't just full of dragons living out on the bayou raising wildlife, it's also got boars blitzing around at full speed. This isn't the first or last time you see an enemy using one of your moves right back at you, but it is the first time that an enemy will barrel right through the invading Norks and defeat enemies that you were already formulating a real-time game plan against, not to mention hitting you with a fun little jump scare if you're not prepared. That plays even better when you realize this world is hot off the heels of the Magic Crafters just before, which has stages where different tribes of wizards are actively at war. In that particular case, they're mostly affecting the platforms and the terrain around you by way of their magic, not actually damaging each other. This in turn acts as an elevated platforming challenge at times, since you now have to move around on much shakier footing. Here though, they're enhancing that dangerous, wild feel of this world by making it clear that you are never safe. This is all to say nothing about Spyro's lived-in levels that encourage you to just glide around corners that you would never expect are necessary progression paths. This is that anti-level design that we'll get to soon. I could straight up go level by level and highlight the ways that many of them dedicate time to expanding the possibilities of Spyro's few moves, but since some of them overlap, I'll quickly hit on one spot where I did kinda lie to you. See, our hero's moveset can actually expand, but only within the scope of a level, only exceedingly temporarily, and you still know that in any stage you're in, you fly through the masked loading screen gate and land on ground with every single tool that you would need to conquer and 100% that level. Some of these aren't even really expansions, as much as, here's a cannon that you can flame to shoot at obstacles. The situational power-ups I'm talking about each enhance one of Spyro's 3 base abilities. There are free flight levels, supercharge pads, and a fairy's kiss that temporarily activates Spyro's super flame. The flight levels themselves are an interesting case because in the original version of the game, you might not even encounter one of these until World 2. Unless you had a friend at the schoolyard or a guide to tell you this, or you just happened to stumble upon it, you won't find out until a dragon tells you way later in the game that the Artisan's World had a 5th level dedicated to flying around if you would open the secret entrance. We'll talk about free flight later. The Supercharge and Fairy's Kiss each make their first appearance in World 3, the world of the Magic Crafters, right when you'll feel like you've fully mastered and exhausted the regular charge and flame abilities. The Fairy's Kiss is only used a couple times, and all it does is briefly let you destroy invincible or metal enemies and obstacles with a flame attack. The Supercharge is a whole different beast that we'll go into in more detail later as well. It drastically speeds you up as you run down these arrow pads, blasting through enemies with invincibility and letting you launch yourself across massive gaps. So long as you don't hit a wall, stop moving, or start gliding, that is. For now, the key with these abilities is that it does further enhance the possibilities within a level, forcing you to think further outside the box when it comes to navigating the terrain. For example, there's an even stronger metal chest now, one that your regular abilities can't even put a dent in. Because the game's put faith and confidence in you that you know you can figure this stuff out, you'll quickly do the math and realize that you're going to need one of these super moves. But how do you map out how to get from a supercharge pad all the way over to that chest without hitting a wall or otherwise losing the charge? You know you can do it, the game's taught you everything you need to know, but can you prove that you've mastered these few moves and now their few temporary upgrades each time they iterate, each time they help you discover a whole new way to use them? These sorts of environmental puzzles don't get particularly challenging most of the time, keep in mind, but that's what adds to Spyro's reward loop. As a player, finding new ways, usually without ever being told, to solve these challenges scratches a more specific itch in your brain, like when you build something cool out of Lego all on your own. It's not like other collectathons just tell you exactly what to do all the time, of course, but few give you the tools, give you a steady progression up to a point, and then say, figure it out from here, you got this. That Insomniac made this work without really retreading too much ground, and without more than a couple levels that maybe push those moves a bit too far. It speaks volumes to their commitment to exhausting everything they could within this game's sandbox. It's what made the game's sequel so challenging to the studio. Much like how musicians have their entire life to create their first album and then suddenly have a year to figure out how to add to it and make a second one, Insomniac had burned all of the first game's ideas on the first game since there was no guarantee there'd be a sequel. In turn, that's part of why capturing Spyro's magic is so difficult. Nowadays especially, developers want to add new and more complex things to their games, and players usually want to experience those new and complex things or else they feel the game's boring. Committing to iterating fully on just a few simple ideas, it's an easy way to get brushed off as just another scrimblow. Plus, I'll throw this out here as well, if you're gonna feature speed or momentum-based platforming challenges, you're probably more likely to take more inspiration from the Sonic school of thought than you are from Spyro. Essentially, Spyro 1 hits this resonance because it was also a right place, right time kind of game. This lets us jump to the second part of that acronym, developers that didn't yet fully know what they were doing. And let's be real, even the most competent designer or studio worth their salt is gonna tell you that they never have any idea what they're doing. Creative solutions are always the name of the game. One little note here though, if you've watched any of my other videos, especially those that involve developer Insomniac games, this breakdown doesn't have the same level of exclusive behind-the-scenes production details and research, in part because I'm not really a Spyro guy. For clarity's sake, this is only the second and third time I've actually fully beaten this game. See, my dad's house had a PS1 with no memory card, so I played the first world or two a ton when I was 5, because what else was I gonna do, go outside and get bullied for being too nice at basketball? This experience also kind of poisoned me with Spyro for a long time, because, well, sometimes when you've played the first chunk of a game to death, the inertia of, right, I've got to play the first few worlds again, that took me hours as a kid, makes it hard for you to want to start over again, so you play something else instead. It's only because I've been on such a big platformer kick recently that this Spyro itch returned, as I realized that everything else I was playing just wasn't really scratching it. Also, I may just have eczema, I don't know. Of course, I quickly reaffirmed that inertia isn't logical, since Spyro is such a short game that the parts I always groaned at having to replay for the 90th time, they only took 40 minutes when you're older than 5. In short, I don't have quite the same level of Spyro info in my noggin, and that also drives home my point a bit. This game stands out so starkly from anything else out there that even the first time you really sit down and dig into it, you're going to take notice. Just as you're fumbling about trying to figure out what the game wants you to do to get to this platform or past that obstacle, Insomniac was a group of just over a dozen dudes fumbling about and pivoting from making a critical darling commercial flop of a Doom clone into developing a mass appeal, family-friendly Nintendo-styled platformer to fill a hole in the PlayStation's rapidly growing youth market. There simply wasn't an infrastructure in place to make a game like Spyro in 1997 when they started. Just the challenge of designing and rendering these worlds that could feasibly be traversed in a single glide from a high peak was gargantuan. Imagine if every level in Mario 64 let you use the wing cap at all times, or if Rare had to design every level in Spyro's fellow 1998 platformer Banjo-Kazooie with a permanent glide in mind. Getting those glide controls just perfect was challenging enough for the studio to bring on an actual NASA flight control specialist. Allowing you to endlessly glide meant needing to design every world even more thoughtfully to avoid, or perhaps encourage the players, breaking the game with their own experimenting. Not to mention having to figure out draw distance so that terrain and gems wouldn't end up impossible to see at a distance. I mean, imagine hunting for the final missing gem in a stage if the game was covered in fog, or if there wasn't a glimmer to indicate there was a gem far away, and having to run right up close to everything to find it. It would completely ruin the spirit of the game, but building in this style did mean hundreds of hours of endless optimization, way more work than playing it safe. Insomniac apparently even joked at the time that this was an insane idea, and a more experienced studio likely avoids even taking that risk due to all the other problems it opens up. But relative inexperience comes with a fiendish hunger. There's not nearly as much to lose if it's just you and your buddies working all night versus putting hundreds of people out of work if risks pan out poorly and your contract gets cancelled after 2 flops in a row. The impact of the team's inexperience stretches further than that though. You ever wonder why Spyro has such non-traditional level theming instead of, lava hub, ice hub, mountain hub, your usual platformer tropes? It's due to the fact that one of the artists was given free reign and decided to create their own little mythos and micro-story out of each dragon tribe and how they impact the world around them. If you, like me, never had this game's manual, you missed out on a flowery fairy tale weaved by Sparks, our dragonfly health bar, that would fit right in with a story that your parents might have read to you at bedtime. It describes each group of dragons and their purpose within the community, such as the Dreamweavers protecting all the creatures in the realm from nightmares, or the Beastmakers being responsible for raising new animals and new species. It even notes something I had never picked up on. Nasty Nork used magic to physically turn the gems into his Nork army. They weren't just waiting for a signal to invade and pillage, the gems became the enemy, similar to many classic platformers. Each of these ambitious early decisions had a ripple effect on what the game and saga would develop into, but it's not all great ideas or masterful execution in the world of dragons. Where just about all of the enemies have their share of Insomniac's trademark personality with fun little idle animations imbued with character, the dragons you rescue often don't. Partly due to hardware limitations, the models of the dragons themselves are a bit more limited, dare I say repetitive, and the only way for their individual personalities or their tribe's vibe to come out is by the way of 5 voice actors, and the rescue animations where dragons are standing on 2 legs specifically to give them arms they can wave around to try and help a little bit with that personality. Those facets, along with the game's manual, do pick up a ton of that slack, don't get me wrong, and even more so the fact that many levels tell their own implicit little story by way of gameplay. That Wizard Civil War I mentioned earlier, for example. But you can only hear
"Thank you for releasing me"
so many times. In Spyro Reignited, the dragons were fleshed out a bit, allowing for example, each of the artisans to be working on something crafty as they thank Spyro or give him a tip. Oh, poor guy dropped his statue. At least to me, this little bit of additional inspiration more than makes up for the fact that Tom Kenny absolutely phoned in most of his time in the booth in the remix, so it's a bit give and take. The dragons show another little bit of general studio inexperience as well, in that in the original game, it can often feel like you're getting repeated tips, or tips out of order, if you're even getting hints at all. Getting a tip about electrified floors in the Beastmaker hub after having navigated that obstacle a couple times, for example, it feels a bit odd. Because of stuff like this, I actually intended my second playthrough, this time with Reignited, to be wrong, for lack of a better word, so I could see if the hints made more sense as individual band-aids, a spot where, when testing, somebody realized you might get stuck. See, in order to move on to the next world, you need to have fulfilled a specific criteria described by the balloonist at the end of the prior hub. To name a couple of these, getting to World 2 requires you to have freed 10 total dragons, so it's interesting that there's a reminder in one of World 2's levels that you can charge enemies with metal armor, something you almost certainly learned unless you completely missed only the Dark Hollow level and did everything else in World 1. To fly into World 3, you need 1200 gems, that's easy enough. World 4, you'll need to have recovered 5 dragon eggs from the Blue Thieves, which opens up another fun, maybe hiccup, since more than half of the game's dragon eggs are in World 3, and there are 0 in the 16 levels after that. With very few exceptions after this where they're holding gems instead of eggs, the thieves themselves are also kind of dropped, as if they've been replaced by the supercharge-based challenges from that point on. That, or the team thought it might be funny if there were exactly 12 eggs, which, hey, fair. I just can't think of many examples of a collectible getting completely dropped at the halfway mark in a game, let alone one specifically tied to a particular skill challenge. It's a sign of a developer flying a little blind, either catching this issue late, perhaps actually coming up with the supercharge partway into production once they had exhausted all the regular charge ideas, or simply choosing to design the game in this sort of way, not even to be subversive since this subgenre's rules were still being carved in stone yet. To circle back to this idea I had of playing Reignited in a way that explored these idiosyncrasies more, I did not do that, mostly because the remix hints were also moved around and modernized a bit for the more modern audience, removing some of those quirky moments where you're told stuff in an odd order. For example, Reignited moves that reveal in World 3 that there's a secret flight level that you may have missed in World 1, instead choosing to hint at it within the Artisan's world to fit more with that theme of, you know, the moment you set foot in a world that you can do everything right then. It helps that this first flight level is, at least in my opinion, the easiest one in the game, a good tutorial for how this separate style of gameplay is meant to work. Each world has one of these timed treasure rounds as described in the game's manual, that are supposed to be hidden away behind doing something special, but outside of the first one, they're not really ever that hidden, they're just usually placed right in the hub world. If these were truly supposed to be a secret bonus every single time, somebody either didn't get the memo or that got changed midway through production and still made it into the game's manual. In these stages, and only in these stages, you have full free flight, not just a descending glide, and you're tasked with destroying 4 strings of targets before the timer runs out. The first stage, for example, asks you to destroy 8 treasure chests, 8 explosive barrels on these hijacked Nork trains, 8 planes, and finally fly through 8 gates. Every item you destroy will refill a little bit of your timer. The struggle here is that the flow state of a regular level, where you can usually start going in any direction you want and organically loop back around, having collected everything without retreading too much ground, this is different from the flow state of these more arcadey flight levels thanks to that timer. The target paths do loop in such a way that finishing one set of targets takes you right to the start of the next most of the time, but only a few of these stages give you enough time to complete them linearly, instead often requiring you to bob and weave between sets of targets in an optimal order, an order you just kind of have to figure out by failing. Everybody has their own take on which ones are the hardest, and some of you probably feel that the secret first flight level should stay secret for a while because the second one is actually a better tutorial. Personally, I disagree, but most of the flights are made with trial and error in mind. I don't think it's exactly antithetical to the regular levels design philosophy, and I actually believe these levels are all really fun, serving a good purpose and contrast to test your thinking in a different manner. But you can't really deny that brute force repetition and having to start over from scratch if you don't nail it is a bit jarring of a contrast, one that Insomniac learned from and tweaked a bit going forward in the sequels. Anyway, moving this hint to World 1, I'm guessing, was one of the things that die-hard fans probably took issue with, but the very idea of just figure it out game design had evolved over the 20 years between Spyro and its reignited treatment, even down to excitedly reading the manual on the way home from the store being replaced with no manual at all. So, understandably, a lot of the manual's clearly spelled out tips got moved into the game itself to avoid new kids dropping off of the game entirely and moving on to one of the million additional distractions that we didn't have as kids. Due to these sorts of tweaks, Reignited ends up clearing up a good number of those little hiccups that I had wanted to explore as a case study during this second part of my back-to-back playthroughs. And also, I'm stupid because I forgot you actually need to use one of the exit gates to open the first boss level, while also forgetting that Spyro 1 doesn't have an additional requirement that you finish the boss level before moving on to the next world. I instill the correct habits in myself, and I exit the level via the pause menu once I've gotten everything in a stage. So I honestly just got sucked into enjoying World 1 without thinking about my mission, and by the time I realized, I had already caught on to what Reignited does to brush off some dust. Dust that isn't necessarily a bad thing, keep in mind. It's part of what makes Spyro in particular so unique, but it's also part of what makes this or any old thing so charming. You get to see how people thought differently when they made the thing in question, whether it's a piece of creative art or a building. I'm just also not gonna fault people who have dust allergies though, and benefit from a bit of housekeeping. To be clear, Reignited has its own bit of developers who didn't fully know what they were doing to it as well, since they were remaking a game as close to identical mechanically as possible without access to the OG source code. I'm gonna be real, I don't think any of these slight mechanical changes or the camera being marginally closer during flight missions or anything like that, I don't think any of this really matters that much. I say that because I look at these styles of remakes more like renovating an old house and having to appeal to the original tenants' rosy, wavy memories from when they were young kids not even taller than their dinner table, looking at the world and the house from a different perspective, while also appealing to a new family moving in. Yeah, they spackled over the notch marks on the doorframe where your parents marked off your height. As adults, most of us understand why, but the kid in us still feels a little disappointed that it's different. It's stuff you may only notice if you're super keyed into the game, if your interpretation is perhaps different than the one the new artist took, or if you're playing the games back-to-back, original to Reignited. I'll give you one of the examples I noticed. One of my favorite touches in this entire game is in the Beastmaker's hub world. The swamp is home to these little tree shrubs that serve no purpose at all. They can get burned, but they don't burn down. They don't give you gems, they're just an environmental touch. They were a flourish thoughtfully crafted by whomever was responsible for this world, because they foreshadow a plant enemy in the Misty Bog stage. That enemy looks identical until they start shaking and reveal they're a charging carnivorous tree, who also reveals if they defeat you that they have a unique death animation. In Reignited, the division of labor may have been different with these levels, such that somebody didn't even know these two things were connected. It happens, and these shrubs are turned into glowing mushrooms instead that you can flame for an achievement and an in-game skill point. Regardless of the version we're talking about, what you or I and the very designers would absolutely call an experience does add that plucky charm to the game. There are even more compromises to this, of course. The boss levels are just slightly smaller stages in their own right, only with a slightly bigger enemy at the end that you have to chase and hit a few times instead of a more fun culmination of what that world has taught you, a small consequence to that limited moveset. The bosses are usually charming, don't get me wrong, but they're not the most satisfying exclamation point to a world as much as a semicolon. It can easily mean to some, because the flight levels are the only change of pace, that this game's experience starts to blend together. Again, a studio with more experience doesn't make this game. That team likely doesn't take risks that push the hardware quite this far this early in the system's lifespan, and they certainly don't try to reinvent game design. That brings me to the third point in our handy-dandy acronym, Rare Anti-Level Design. Again, no relation to Rareware, I needed an R. But the word rare is in fact important here. There's a difference between deliberate subversion of game design, an attempt at striking out your own dialect in the language of game design, and bad level design that just doesn't follow the guardrails whatsoever. Spyro 1's level design is wonky, full of what an outsider might see as blind leaps of faith, a big no-no, especially when bottomless pits end up involved fairly quickly. It goes beyond the usual tenets of platformer design, again a risk you'd usually only see an inexperienced team confidently taking on. But I'm gonna contend that this risk was certainly calculated, and actually, it's more like calculus. Platformer algebra, if you'll ride with me here, is jumping from level to level, platform to platform, taking out enemies using the skills that you have, and solving for X by completing the objective in question. X might be reaching the end of a side-scrolling stage, or saving the princess, or collecting all the things. As we've well gone over by this point, in any well-designed platformer and video game in general, you know the tools that you have available to help you solve for X. By the time Insomniac started working on Spyro, the rules had been clearly laid out for a decade and a half, ever since Donkey Kong and Pitfall had established the floor. It was just a way this algebra was taught that had changed, really. Spyro 1 takes that and adds a layer on top of it, sometimes asking you to observe your surroundings more deeply than the few contemporary collectathons that had existed up to this point. You still know your tools, you know you're usually solving for X, but Spyro asks you to account for the sum of even smaller, continuously changing factors. You're not wall jumping up to a thing, you're weighing whether you have enough height and distance to glide down and clear the landing. You're not staring up at a mountain, looking solely at the platforming path you need to take to get to the top. You're also watching the doorways and corners around this mountain's curving path, noting the unbreakable chests, the orphaned platforms that look like there might not be a way to reach them, but you know there is, the supercharge pads and the huge gaps you'll need to cross and chain together without physically seeing the path until you're in mid-air. It might, to an outsider, look like a badly designed leap of faith, just like calculus might look like gibberish until you start to learn how it works. And even then, some people just don't get calculus and they don't get Spyro, while some of us are fucking nerds who love that extra layer of thought that you sometimes need to put in to solve for X. No level shows this application of Spyro's math better than, I can't believe I'm saying this, Treetops. If you're not familiar, Treetops is the most infamous level in the first Spyro game. It's one of those few I mentioned earlier that's almost certain to drain your lives when you first experience it, and it's perhaps the best example of all three themes I've hit on so far. If you are familiar, before you groan or maybe giddily squeal at the idea of somebody defending Treetops, those three themes do include developers not fully knowing what they're doing. It's a unique example of a mastery challenge that feels both like it's taught perfectly well on paper to the point that people can defend it, while also going too far in practice and showcasing a spot where the designers absolutely learned some hard lessons. Kinda like that overexcited math teacher who gets ahead of themselves and starts talking about multivariate calculus to a bunch of pre-calc students. Placed in the Beastmaker's world, Treetops at first feels like the endgame of the supercharge mechanic that had only been introduced one world prior. The entire name of the game here is zooming down supercharge paths and taking massive leaps over bottomless pits in order to track down some of Spyro 1's final few thieves, now holding on to valuable gems since the price of eggs went up. However, what makes Treetops so tricky is, as one of the dragons here hints, that you don't have to stop at just one supercharge charge. You can go even further beyond. First, let me take it back a bit. The supercharge, like the other mechanics, is taught to you quite well over the course of multiple levels, with each one instilling a key part of the formula. In World 3's High Caves, you're given free rein to mess around with the supercharge, learning how to manipulate its wide turns in mid-air and reach paths that might otherwise look unreachable. And you learn that if you glide, you lose the extra momentum and revert back to normal speed. Thanks to the fairies hanging out inside the chasm that splits up this stage, your experimenting is entirely safe too. If you fall, they'll bring you right back to the start of the supercharge pad rather than costing you a life. Another of this world's stages, Wizard Peak, asks you to put this knowledge to use under regular game circumstances, with enemies around the map and with no safety net. There are two additional lessons here that are perhaps a bit too understated as well, and this is what causes issues in Treetops. One section of the stage has three supercharge pads all near each other, two directly opposite one another, sort of like a half-pipe setup, and the other one in the middle that goes further down into a different area. Now, the half-pipe is meant to show that if you are supercharging the wrong way up a supercharge pad, it will cancel out. And although you might not consciously catch it, having to run down two supercharge pads in a row to be able to reach a far-off island is your tell that supercharges do stack. In other words, 1 plus 1 equals 2, and that takes us back to math and back to treetops, the functional endpoint to both supercharging across wide chasms and supercharges having this second gear. There are 2 gem thieves here, one wearing red, which is easier, and one wearing green, which is the harder one. Sidebar, I know that with Spyro 1's color coding where red gems are only worth 1, this would probably make sense, but there's a reason that green is usually easier than red, so that's already a bit of a faux pas. For both of them, you have to circle around a string of wooden ramps using supercharges, taking those calculated, not really leaps of faith the game has already taught us to trust in order to get to the high point at the end and defeat these little punks once and for all. Now the red one is more a matter of just getting the path down, but the green one takes everything you've been taught and that supercharged math and puts it all to use at once, asking you to look around at the hints in the terrain, and the dragon at the start of the sequence even gives you the vague nudge of don't just stop at one supercharge. Within the context of the game's lessons, I think this final mastery challenge in Treetops isn't necessarily unfair. Asking you to sprint down one ramp, leap onto another one to hit second gear, taking a hard leap to the right just as you've already done on the easier red challenge and throughout the game, it feels like you're breaking the game or maybe pushing it too far, especially because the jumps are pretty tight in spacing, but that's not unlike a lot of what the game has taught you. It just stretches that trust maybe a bit too much, and what takes it to unfair is the missing lesson here, since the game never set up a point to clearly, let alone safely, explain that the supercharge math of 1 plus 1 minus 1 still equals 1. What that means is that players probably, although not definitely, discovered that supercharging up one ramp backwards would cancel out the charge, so arguably it would be a fair leap that when you run backwards up this third ramp while having 2 charges, you would still have 1 charge left and continue supercharging to make it to your 4th ramp, which in turn takes you to the thief and the final dragon in this level. That part's basic math, right? With how many adults still struggle with this stage today and the collective trauma bond that a ton of players have had online over how much they struggled with Treetops as a kid, it's a clear design failing to expect first graders to have made this leap. Spyro shares that sentiment, throwing out a passive comment about how this dragon could have picked an easier spot. Now in concept, I think this level is smart. It's too smart, actually. It's maybe the clearest example of a level where you're expected to observe your surroundings, to chart a path, and the moment you do that, it all feels kind of obvious. At least a little obvious. After all, you absolutely know by this point that you've entered this level with every skill needed to finish it, and you've more than learned that this game takes a non-traditional approach to level design, requiring this observation or calculus instead of just brute forcing it or using only algebra alone. It even incorporates some of what we've learned in the flight stages, forcing you to think and react on your toes instead of only taking your time. But where every other calculus skill in the game is taught to you in some form before being stretched to this logical conclusion, before asking you to figure it out, this one sort of misses the jump. I mean, even the flight levels had fairies holding big-ass arrow signs telling you where to turn. To some, it may feel incredibly satisfying to get to that apex, or at the very least to others, it feels like a sigh of relief, but a couple small changes would remove this dip in overall quality entirely and make Treetops a serviceable level to everybody. For one, there's no guarantee that players even see the easier red thief first, since he's further away than the green one you see in the stage's opening cutscene, a rare time a stage even has an opening cutscene. More than that, it's only in digging more into Spyro this time around and trying things that are sometimes opposite to what the game teaches that I found out you can actually keep up with these way speedier than usual thieves. They don't just start the level and then disappear. If you're fast enough, the green one even stays near the checkpoint to taunt you instead of despawning entirely, and you can follow him down the exact path you're supposed to take to catch him at the end. The problem is, he will disappear if you aren't following him fast enough to see him taunting at this checkpoint, and even chasing him involves dodging around enemies and, if it's your first time going through the level, ignoring every gem or dragon along the way. That includes the one at this checkpoint giving you the hint to use multiple supercharges. These guys are so fast that if you slip up once, they are completely out of your view until they reach their endpoint and you'll have no real idea what you're supposed to do. Now yes, if you leave the level and come back, they do reset, and since a lot of players either got discouraged and had to give up for the first time here, or they actually ran out of lives and had to re-enter, technically, yes, sure, you can say the level has ample opportunity for you to learn to chase these thieves and ignore everything else, it just does it in a way that's antithetical to everything the game's taught you so far. Simply moving the dragon checkpoint before the final test here, and forcing the thief to reset to near the ramp when you respawn so that you can, actually chase him like the game has taught you to do with thieves, that would have solved most of this right then and there. And yes, I know you can do some really fun workarounds instead of doing this whole roundabout 4-ramp strategy that you're supposed to do, such as hugging the side of the wall or timing this first ramp perfectly and hanging left instead of right. Those are honestly much more in the spirit of the game than this intended path tends to feel. In essence, Treetops, even with all of these issues that a lot of players have dreaded for years, it ends up being the exception that proves the rule with a lot of what I've talked about today. There's actually a better culmination of the supercharge mechanic as a whole later in the Haunted Towers level, where you not only get called a master of the move by the final dragon you rescue there, you're also rewarded with a semi-permanent super flame at the end that lasts until you exit the stage. It's a much better reward than a sassy cutscene and then leaving the stage. The Dreamweaver's world beyond Haunted Towers really does feel like a final silo for you to prove that you've learned all the ways the game has taught you to think critically about its own design. It does this by manipulating the reality of the stages themselves even further than that anti-level design we've been taught to expect and lean into. The fools spawning time-sensitive platforms somewhere even maybe far away from where they're placed in the level, the enemies that change shape in the dark or when hit by a new type of cannon. The first dragon you rescue in Dreamweavers even tells you to prepare to face what isn't there, which could just as easily be a statement about the game you've already played writ large. By this point, you're ready for it. You've found all the places that might otherwise feel like a leap of faith if you hadn't been taught the extra observational skills and intuition present in Spyro 1, if you hadn't been taught platforming calculus. But Treetops will always be the supercharge level that gets remembered more for all the trouble it caused, for the lessons it taught the designers themselves about how to teach better. It's a good example both of how this non-traditional level design approach can, in fact, go too far if it's not reined in, and again really, of each point so far in our acronym about what makes Spyro so one of a kind. There's not a chance in hell you'd ever see a level quite like Treetops again, even in a world where Spyro-styled games weren't impossible to come by. You'd actually need to turn the clock back about 30 years to see this wild west of 3D game design return, as there are far too many standards that are now, thankfully, ingrained. Just the leaps of faith alone, regardless of if they were clearly taught or somehow spelled out in game, all it would take today is one that's a bit too out there early on, for players to get frustrated and fall off a game entirely, probably forever. We've got so many games at our disposal now that we're not playing, and then we go and buy 40 more on Steam sales, and gone are the days where many kids maybe only had one new game a year. Any nowadays subversive design is a risk of a game being written off as a flawed attempt. At a point, it doesn't matter how magical you are. That brings us to the final part of our Spyro is a D.R.A.G acronym, a touch of good old Insomniac games magic, and that Dreamweaver's world has a few examples to this point. To name one, did you ever consider that the reason that there are no egg thieves in Dreamweavers is because children kill your dreams? Yeah, think about it. Okay, no, Insomniac magic is just one of those inexplicable essences that simply clicks. It's that charm you find in the work of your favorite developers, the shared DNA from game to game that you point at and go, oh, that's like that thing I like. It's things like enemies having unique idle animations, or sleeping, or mooning you to dare you to come after them. To name one of these that I really enjoyed, there's an enemy in Dreamweaver's boss stage called the Pansy, a mutated monster that's holding a single flower. When I was taking my notes, these guys caught me off guard because it felt like a sad little story in itself. Were these peaceful creatures that got turned into monsters? Were they sentient? And do they have a bit of those memories still in there, even though their minds are now trapped in the body of a lizard thing? It's the kind of little detail I've learned to expect from this studio over the years, and I was rewarded for paying attention by, well, I guess feeling bad for putting them out of their misery for the sake of money. Reignited takes a different, more overt interpretation of the creature, making it a happy little lizard wearing a little dress and with a flower in its hair. Totally fair interpretation for Reignited to take, and I honestly like a lot of Reignited's redesigned enemies, but this one got a bit lost for me. More generally though, no other game gives you 80 Power Star equivalents, gives them speaking roles, and then has half of them simply say thank you or give you some crotchety old man lecture. That's just something the team thought might be funny if our plucky hero and the player controlling him got progressively annoyed at all the times the dragons just weren't helpful, proving their hubris that caused the Nork invasion to begin with, and giving Spyro a reason to throw some sassy jabs out, all while not taking away from the satisfying feeling itself of saving the dragons. Most of Spyro 1's enemies have this sort of thing to them too, and that's certainly true for the rest of the trilogy as well. Insomniac's always had an art team that feels free to go nuts with any inspiration it gets, and when you can tell that the game you're playing was made by people who had fun making it, you have more fun with it too. Part of why Insomniac always seemed to have a more direct fan-based continuation from PS1 to 2 and onward than the Crash to Jak to Uncharted pipeline is because this DNA did not change at its core. As Ratchet evolved on the PS2, even as level designs modernized, you knew that you were getting a taste of that fishbowl and straw philosophy that Insomniac utilized. Big central areas that anchor a level, with little paths that forked off and worked their way back around to the hub, only now leaving you higher up or looking at that main area with a new perspective. Hell, the wizard war that goes on in the Magic Crafters, or the boars charging through Norks, Insomniac continued with that mindset too, with games that continued putting different factions of enemy at odds with one another within certain levels. They didn't care that having to code enemy logic to deal with multiple factions at once and whether to fight the player or the other enemies or what to do, they didn't care that that was extra work because this added extra life to the world. Even as this studio has continued to grow, and even with games that had much more mass market appeal than any of the ones we've talked about so far, much of their DNA remains if you know where to look. One day down the road I'll make my video talking about how Spider-Man 1 is actually a secret Ratchet & Clank game, but that's a story for another day. It's this above and beyond mentality that led to a lot of the studio's growing pains during the PS2 and 3 era, as I've covered in my Ratchet retrospectives, as ambition caught up with reality and they started fighting from behind to keep up. But it's that same commitment that leads to things that make Insomniac's titles stand out year after year, and somehow they keep releasing games year after year. The punch and impact of the sound effects I mentioned earlier, for example, are a quality in a good game that can never be understated. You may never notice it actively or be able to point it out, but the sounds feeling right is the difference between a good game and a stellar one. It's part of why there are passionate fans that don't care for many of Reignited's smaller changes, because it's an impossible bar to live up to. Reignited actually does make one change though that one of the original creatives wanted to implement in the PS1 game but couldn't, a dynamic soundtrack that changes and flourishes depending on what you do. That creative in question was legendary drummer Stuart Copeland of The Police fame, no relation. Since there were tech limitations to implementing a dynamic soundtrack on top of everything else Spyro was juggling, Copeland simply made the soundtracks dynamic in his own way by ensuring that there would be new flourishes you might notice the 10th or 20th or 30th time you heard the song, maybe just because that time you did something cool the exact moment the music changed. Now, I don't tend to describe music too much when I'm digging into a game because that's not really my forte. It ends up with me poorly telling the story the tracks themselves are trying to tell. Game soundtracks are an enhancement piece to the level atmosphere, to the aesthetic, and they speak for themselves better than I ever could speak for them. That's not to say this soundtrack isn't fantastic, it is, and even though Copeland certainly wasn't working at Insomniac, his creative process absolutely fit right in. Listen to how he describes the best feeling about composing, and I want you to hear what he says, keeping in mind all that we've said about this game's feeling of organic discovery and of putting the pieces together yourself.
What's the great moment of being a composer? Is it when the audience lights up into your music, or is it the reviews? He said, no. The best moment is when you find that note you're looking for and you get that chord which leads to that chord, and you've got this under thing happening there which pays off right here. At the same time, set it and you crack it and you've got it, it goes there and it does it. That's it. And it's downhill from there.
That sounds familiar. Spyro's not even close to the only 3D platformer or collectathon that fits that description, of course. It may be the only one that imbues this so deeply into its very DNA, though. There are platformers that have this perfect chain effect by combining moves and doing some insane string of acrobatic stunts to get you across a gap in a new, perhaps unintended way. Spyro, though, isn't really about chaining a ton of moves together since you only have a couple. It's about deducing which ones are the right ones to put together in a specific context. There are highly polished platformers and collectathons that have taken everything we've learned about the genre and about game design and put it together masterfully. Spyro's not that, although its ambition helps mask it. It's a game that was being made as the concrete foundation of the 3D platformer genre was still yet hardening, and it goes against the now expected grain by giving you a different kind of freedom to discover. Thanks both to this unique approach to level design and the team's inexperience and therefore hunger, the game's ability to take risks and fail without being seen as breaking the hard rules of design meant that Spyro got to stand out without being chastised for doing it. Even in just this breakdown here, I've only dug deep into about a quarter of the game's levels too. You can pick this game up and look at any world and see how these qualities define just about every stage they're in, from the earliest facets of design to the finished, maybe renovated, product on your screen. It's almost a luxury that other games and developers since haven't had because of Insomniac being in the right place at the right time with the right idea that, if done today, would be seen as wrong or would be too big due to players or publishers expecting bigger, bloated levels or a more expansive moveset. In many ways, there can't be another game quite like Spyro, because both making and playing this kind of game that slowly builds on only a few mechanics would require a sort of patience and trust today that we often struggle to have. I'll say again, to be clear, this isn't even close to my favorite platformer, although digging into it here and analyzing it more certainly did move it up a few notches. Sometimes you just have an itch that other games might be able to scratch at the surface, but it's an itch that those games can't make go away. It's a craving for a very specific sort of home-cooked meal with long discontinued ingredients, the kind of meal that even a world-renowned chef would struggle to perfectly emulate. So if your friends ask you, what about this game makes it so special? Tell them Spyro's a drag. Hopefully they'll listen to you gush for the hour afterwards about what that means, because if they do, I'm fairly certain they'll want to try it for themselves by the end. Or you can just send them here instead, just make sure they subscribe too. And hey, the more people that appreciate what it is about this specific game that makes it one of one, the more people will clamor for a game that can finally capture more of that essence, and maybe one day everything comes together just perfectly that we can get another game that can finally capture more of that essence. Until then, Spyro's always going to be a true one-of-a-kind game. Till next time, stay golden. I want to give a special thank you to all of my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members for making videos like this possible, including Koi T. Allen, Goldstorm07, Jump Rock, Mason Hunt, The Critic of Innocence, and Thomas Kuzma. If you want to see your name on this list, get early or ad-free access to videos, and much more, well, you know what to do. Thank you.